The original to this coat is part of the Reverend John Parkinson's collection. He was born in 1754 and died in 1840. And among his collections, among his other belongings, was this collection of kind of clothing that the fashion details dated it from around sort of late 1770s to 1790s. He had clearly kept it, as a collection. There wasn't fashions from before that, and there wasn't really sort of clothing from after that date. So it's quite intriguing as to why this collection of coats, breeches and waistcoats were kept from his he would have been about 20, 30 to sort of maybe 40 years old at this point. And during that part of his life, he was actually doing a lot of traveling. He did a lot of touring of England, of the kind of countryside, and seemed to have taken along sort of young lads that were needing to be educated. So he seemed to help them with their finances and then took them around. So they went to the Isle of Wight and they came down to Cornwall and all that kind of stuff. And he also went to Switzerland. He did a big tour around Switzerland, and he took, it was either his friend or it was another gentleman that was wanting to do a grand tour. But it seems to be that it was a gentleman who was doing a grand tour. But because of the French Revolution, the gentleman's father, the gentleman's called Boutel, his father asked that he could not do the grand tour as normal, so France and Italy, but actually that they went somewhere else. So for whatever reason, they chose Russia, Crimea, sort of all of that kind of area. And those diaries have been published, which is fascinating. So it's quite incredible to be able to read diaries from the same period. So that might be why this costume collection was kept. And it's a really rare opportunity to study a collection of coats, waistcoats and breeches that all stem from the one man. Quite often you'll be able to study a coat in the museum, but you won't know who it belonged to, and you don't know if he owned any other coats that have happened to have been sold into museums. You just have that one coat. Whereas to be able to study an entire collection, who we know the man who belonged to, I just provide so much more different kind of ways of studying the collection and different information that can be gleaned from it. For example, all of these coats, though they feature very similar in sort of similarities in fashion details, like the cuff, the collar, the pocket flaps, for example, they're all similar in that method, but there's a lot of distinct differences in the actual pattern cutting that you can tell from studying them. So things like that, just being able to see and plot differences when we know the figure that they were cutting for wouldn't have varied that much. So it really gives us a lot of information about pattern cutting, about the development of pattern cutting throughout that kind of period, late 70s to sort of 1790s. You've got a good 20 years of fashion developing slowly. And also within this collection you have, so for example, this is 4P, and 4P has a coat and a waistcoat that belong to that same numbering, and they match, they're cut for the same fabric, so they would have been cut as a suit, which means that suddenly we can study the relationship between the waistcoat and the coat, the waistcoat and the other waistcoats in the collection, as well as the coat and the other coats in the collection. So it just really fills out a lot more questions and answers that we can glean from this collection. One of the big questions with pattern cutting or pattern drafting is this topic of ease. So ease is basically what makes a garment stylistically, fashionably bigger than the person's measurement. It also is functional. So for example, if this sleeve was dead tight, I wouldn't actually be able to move my arm. So ease is a functional element that allows movement of the clothing, but also is stylistic. This top is cut to be slightly bigger than me so that it drapes, it hangs, it looks natural. That's kind of ease. So there's a functional side of ease and there's a fashionable side of ease. So because all of these coats and waistcoats and breeches have been cut for the one figure, it really helps build up some evidence for how they are using and drafting their ease. For example, with this coat here, because it has a waistcoat with it, we can study the difference in ease between the coat and the waistcoat. So the waistcoats are generally cut to be slightly closer fitting. Obviously we don't know how tight, but it certainly seems from portraiture that they would generally cut to at least be able to be done up. There seems to be a fashion for not buttoning this section of the waistcoat, but the fact is that it's been drafted so that it can be buttoned up completely. So this gives us a really good idea of the original wearer's figure, whereas the coats, particularly for this part of the 18th century, you begin to get a large cutaway. You get more curve around the chest, and then it sweeps back around the body. And that cutaway isn't evident in the coat, in the sense of you can take a pattern of the coat, but you've got no idea how much cutaway has been taken off. So being able to study a coat with its, corresponding waistcoat really sort of fills in that missing information that we've lost from the cutaway part of the coat. And seeing how much bigger the coat is to the waistcoat, and even things like the different thigh shapes, the thigh is the armhole, the different armhole shapes, the different neckline shapes, just little details like that really help fill out a picture of how the drafters, fashionably wise, were knowing how to cut the two garments to correspond with each other. So that is why I'm replicating this particular coat. There's 8 coats out of the collection, but I just wanted to be able to study this relationship between the waistcoat and the coat. So these are actually panels that I've taken from the original pattern. Handily, this one had a stripe, so it was quite easy to take a pattern from. But yeah, so this is all this pile here, and today's job is to just slowly work my way through it, getting it ready for beginning to work on. And I'm having to mount my silk fabric onto linen because my silk is a little bit too lightweight. It was a little bit lightweight to begin with, but then I dyed it because the original to this is like a brown with a very strong purple stripe, but then it's become faded, so it's kind of turned into this mulberry purple and this warm brown, which is why I've dyed my silk just that little bit more purple. But when I dyed it, it actually took out all of the stiffness and the solidity of the silk, so I'm having to mount mine onto linen because otherwise the silk wouldn't really be suitable for making a coat. The original to this 4P isn't mounted on linen, but it is not an unknown method in the 18th century tailoring. For example, SNO90 in the National Trust collection is mounted onto linen. It's a silk velvet, but it's mounted onto linen prior to construction, so they are aware that the silk velvet wasn't firm enough. And I think there's a coat in the Bath Fashion Museum as well that features a plain silk that's just been mounted onto linen. So it is a method that was used in the 18th century, probably for the same reasons that I'm having to do it, that the silk itself just needs that little bit of body and a bit of support. So that is literally my job today, is just to slowly work through my pile and mount the silk onto the linen. This method that I'm using is just a running stitch. There is, in fact, it might have been SNO90, but there's a SNO90, the lining is quite degraded, so you can see quite a bit of the inside. It made it very tricky to study because we were having to be very slow and very careful to not sort of overly move the coat at all. But there was one bit at the shoulder, for example, where you could see the seam allowance folded in on the underside underneath the lining. And one side they'd whipped the silk velvet onto the linen, and on the other side they'd running tacked it like I'm doing here. So whether that's evidence of 2 people preparing the panels for making like I'm doing today, but they're both using their favourite techniques. So one is whipping and one is running stitching, or there's a reason behind whip stitch versus running stitch that I'm not aware of. So it might be that for certain shapes it works better, I don't know. But anyway, on the shoulder seam, one was running tacked, like I'm doing here, and the other was whipped. So before I can even start the coat, all of this needs doing so that the silk is firm enough to be handled.